The view of Earth from space in 1968 was a revelation to the Apollo astronauts.
And for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
Their mission brought home to everyone just how vulnerable the world is. The astronauts found God, the rest of the world found eco-politics. The millions who watched the Apollo missions knew that planet Earth is blue only in space and pop songs. The reality was polluted rivers, filthy air, and rapidly disappearing countryside. Something, they said, had to be done. The politicians agreed, and the UN held its first World Conference on the Environment in Stockholm in June 1972.
I declare open the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment.
The conference was organised by Maurice Strong, who 20 years later is the driving force behind the Rio Summit. At Stockholm, the rich North and poor South concentrated on the environment. 8 years later, the Brandt report emphasised the importance of economic development for the South. The spirit of Stockholm also inspired a report by the Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. It called for political change, and it recommended sustainable development. Over the past 20 years, hundreds of grassroots organisations have proved the point that development doesn't have to damage the environment. The Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales uses wind power to reduce the need to burn polluting fossil fuels. With solar and water power in support, the centre generates 90% of the energy needed to support 20 resident staff and up to 1,000 visitors a day. Both rich and poor countries can benefit from such technologies. Such advances, though, are small scale. What's needed is a political commitment at the highest level. So 3 years ago, the United Nations began planning this week's World Summit, based on the Brundtland Agenda for Sustainable Development. The hope now is that with East-West confrontations at an end, world leaders will give North-South issues a greater priority. The fear, though, is that the Rio Summit is being overwhelmed by the enormity of its task. Participants leaving London for Rio at the weekend were heading for a talking shop of unprecedented proportions. 2 years of preparation have produced 24 million pages of documents. Over 100 world leaders will join over 4,000 delegates. Tension is high between North and South. The developing countries want more financial assistance. The rich worry about damaging their economies.
The North is saying that they're already doing an awful lot through the development aid flows, through the debt cancellation round which is going on, and so on and so forth. And they're not on this occasion going to do any more. And the South are making this particular occasion a demand. We need more, otherwise we can't move. And at the moment it's been very deadlocked, and frankly there is a terrific tension between the North and the South. Nobody quite knows how it's going to work out in Rio.
The summit's agenda is headed by the Rio Declaration, which contains 27 rather woolly, well-intentioned principles for the conference to adopt.
States shall cooperate in a spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem.
But high-sounding words need a programme for action. That's supposed to be provided by at least 2 international treaties due to be signed at Rio. The first is the Climate Change Convention. The convention aims to combat global warming. The 80s was the hottest decade on record, and some attribute that to the 12% rise in the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the past 30 years. Scientists won't be sure of the connection for another decade, but by then action may be too late. The convention is an attempt to close the door before the horse bolts. The hope was that the convention would commit signatories to return carbon dioxide emissions to 1990 levels by the end of this decade. But the United States fears the impact on its industry of any new measures to curb pollution. The result is that the commitment to reduce carbon dioxide emissions is voluntary in the treaty. The second treaty is the Biodiversity Convention. But the prospects for preserving the valuable resources in the rainforests have been severely dented by the US refusal to sign. The American decision was foreshadowed by months of haggling over the wording of the treaty. 14 out of the 21 articles are qualified by clauses like "when appropriate" or "as appropriate." Valuable resources could yet be saved by a forestry convention promoted by the North. But that's being resisted by developing countries such as Malaysia, which don't want to damage their logging industries.
The conventions are one thing, and particularly the climate convention, potentially very important. But I think much more significant in the long run is actually this thing called Agenda 21, which isn't a binding arrangement, but it is meant to be setting out the priorities for the 21st century if we're to move towards a sustainable future. And that, for the majority of mankind, is frankly the thing that matters, because poverty is the issue.
It seems there's no shortcut to cleaning up the world. Agenda 21 is an 800-page document. There is a summary, but that's 120 pages. Buried in all this are two broad issues. The first is technology transfer. Western technology has not always brought benefits to the developing world. 3,000 people died after the chemical explosion at Bhopal in 1984. But Agenda 21 aims to encourage high-tech, environmentally sound technologies and the expertise to maintain them, so that past tragedies can be avoided. The sticking point is likely to be the multinationals' reluctance to lose the intellectual property rights to such technologies. For any transfers to take place, though, financial assistance will be necessary. At the moment, the South is desperately short of money. In 1990, all new loans from the northern wealthy nations came to 110 billion American dollars. But repayment and interest charges on loans already made to southern developing countries came to $143 billion for the year. So there was a net outflow of funds from the south to the north of $33 billion. The Rio Agenda suggests using the World Bank's Global Environment Facility to channel fresh funds to the south. The snag, though, is that the summit organisers estimate $125 billion is needed to fund all the ideas up for negotiation. So far, only $2 to $5 billion is likely to be forthcoming from the rich nations.